Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. We are going to talk about what do we value and how do we measure it. And this will be the third iteration on this particular webinar, which has been quite popular over the years, especially since the COVID-19 pandemic. But redoing and updating this particular one because it is always and continually important for us to understand how we can quantify and qualify the value that we bring as collection stewards. And equally important is how do we measure that in ways that can be communicated effectively to the people who need to know. So introduction, let's get into about us. If you're new to the webinars or new to me, I am Rachel Woody, the founder and director of Relicura. I've had 20 years across archives, museums, and cultural heritage institutions. And in addition to being a business owner and consultant, I am also author and speaker and people first advocate. A little of the, as per usual, housekeeping here. Link to the recording and links to any of the resources that we'll talk about today will be sent via email 24 hours from the premiere date and time. Links will also be shared if you're joining us for the premiere. Will be shared in the chat as we talk about them. With that said, this session is pre-recorded. That's so I can deliver the maximum amount of information to you while also being able to answer any follow-up questions or add additional thoughts in the chat. And with that, if you do have a YouTube account or a Google account, I think even you are able to use the chat box feature. So please feel free to share examples and resources that you may have that seem pertinent to the discussion, as well as any questions you may have. And because this is a YouTube platform player that we are using, it comes with all of the regular YouTube player features and buttons. So depending on the screen you're watching it on, you can adjust the ratio of quality for that screen, as well as be able to take advantage of closed captioning. And then just please remember that this content is my own, and please be respectful in sharing it. Okay, contents. We're going to keep it pretty specific and honed in on this one. We'll talk about how to identify value for collections work, and then getting into the quantification of value, then the important packaging of value and that information and how to communicate it. So walking through like start to end on the steps here in terms of communicating value, how do I identify it, how do we measure, how do we package, and then how do we share that with the people who need to know. So first up, identifying value. When we're talking about value, it is a very broad and squishy term depending on who is using it, what they're using it for, and of course has different, very subjective value sets with it. So when we talk about what we value as collection stewards, we value the work of collections care, the work of collections management, and collections access. The work and of course the importance of information delivery with those things, with providing access to our collections and the data that comes with it. So those are things that we value. And it can sometimes be very easy for us living in our very particular niche to think that, well, we value these seem obvious, and surely other people value these too. Unfortunately, that is not as widespread in terms of understanding, and that is why we have a whole hour webinar on this topic. So what capitalism values? So money, which is the one and only bullet point on this slide, and is very different from what it is that we value as collection workers. But it does lend a very jarring and interesting sort of shift for us to think, okay, the things that we valued, there was no obvious or immediate money tied to them. However, capitalism, and of course in the United States, a very capitalist country, even though we are in nonprofits for most of us, or even government agencies where like making money is not necessarily the primary objective, it still has such a tremendous impact on how decisions are made, how things are resourced, what is ultimately valued and prioritized. So it's important for us to realize that ultimately most of the people and most of the apparatuses we work within value money. So we are now living in a construct of where value equals revenue, essentially, for our particular situations within our museums and archives. And when we think about revenue for those particular institutions, there are usually a few different revenue streams. Now, the concept of revenue streams is not new. And for many institutions, there can be different types of revenue streams or different combinations of revenue streams. There is a link at the bottom of this slide, and we'll put it in the chat for you as well. In the 2020 Trends Watch, there was some great coverage on the future of financial sustainability. And so some of the framing they used and the revenue streams they identified are the four that we see here, which is earned income. So for museums, the obvious earned income could be from museum ticket attendance, special exhibitions, event rental space, that kind of thing. Charitable income, which it could be donations from donors. Sometimes it could also be from granting foundations that aren't government run, which is, of course, the next bullet point, government funding. That could be government funding through your budget, if you're a municipal entity or supported by a municipal entity, all the way to like federal grants, state grants, that kind of thing. And then the last one, which is perhaps more common for larger institutions, but can still be very present, is capital. And capital is including financial investments. So for example, if the organization has an endowment, for example, the endowments are typically a financial investment, which is how there could be a whole webinar on endowments, but essentially financial investments and the revenue that can be made from that helps to keep the endowment perpetual, or at least if it's set up well and money is not taken out of it at a point to which it is taking more money than can be made, those are usually in perpetuity. So continuing this value equals revenue. So to give you some of those examples in text that we went over. So earned income, anything from membership, tuition, retail gift shop, attendance, special events. Charitable income, grants and donors, but again, grants from like a non-government entity, which is a whole separate government funding, which could be grants, bonds, for example. Bonds can usually be for specific, like over a 5-year period, for example, to help do some capital improvements on a particular building. Similar with levies, and then budgetary line items. So a few different ways each of these revenue streams could be fed or have money be put into them. And that is important for us to keep in mind, because when we think about how to tie the values we've identified to revenue, we need to have like a map for people, like a bit of a translation map for everybody. So when we think about the revenue streams and the different things that lead to bringing in revenue, what do these all have in common? And what they all have in common is that they require engagement. There's some mechanism for each and every one of these that requires engagement with between museum and archive and the community or person or stakeholder, whomever that is that you are serving. With that in mind, so community engagement, there's both the direct and indirect ties to income streams. So the healthier the organization's engagement is, the healthier the revenue streams will be. There's usually direct correlation unless something has gone catastrophically wrong. And so for us, we need to think about those direct and indirect ties, which leads us into our next section, which is identifying points of engagement to help make that direct tie for people. So revenue derived from engagement, as we sit down to work on this, we need to identify every revenue event, and that's by identifying engagement events. Two, to map out how your work supports each, especially if it's more in the indirect category, and we'll go through a couple examples together. And then three, brainstorm how you can adapt your work to better support revenue events. So we're going to first learn how to identify those revenue events. We're going to figure out the direct and indirect ways in which our work supports those revenue events, and then, of course, how we can further evolve our positions and the work that we do to increase that support of bringing revenue in. So, examples. For an example of an archivist supporting a university who's celebrating its sesquicentennial, so 150 years, of which many of the institutions, at least out here in the Pacific Northwest, some of our oldest are right around that age mark. And so for archivists, when they're supporting universities for many events such as homecoming or for these milestone celebrations like a sesquicentennial, the work that the archivist does is more an indirect support. So research within the archives, pulling photos and perhaps artifacts for different events, or perhaps to include images of in any of like the celebration brochures or advertisements or what have you. It's showing oral histories or conducting oral histories during this time. So all of the work in and of itself isn't necessarily an exchange of money. However, it is indirect and just under the surface there of helping the university at large strengthen their connections to the community, their alumni base, their students and potential students. And having those then usually lead to money, whether that is donations, whether that's increased students coming to the university due to increased awareness, further grants or municipal support of the university, especially in these milestone years, even down to helping with like the local tourism board. Usually, especially for smaller universities, town and university are usually cohabitating in a symbiotic way, where if the university is doing well, so is town tourism and vice versa. So that is one of the peak examples, especially for archivists, where the work is behind the scenes for better or worse. Better sometimes because it means we get to do work perhaps less with less interruptions, but a challenge because that means not as many people see the amazing work that is being done and how that work ties to bringing revenue in. Another example is a registrar or archivist who's cataloging the collections within a collections management system, so CMS. Again, that's very technical, very typically behind the scenes work. In this particular case, this is work that's done throughout the day, throughout the year kind of thing. There's not like a specific milestone event like our previous example. And yet, cataloging the collections, making sure they're in the CMS for increased collections care and management for the betterment of that, as well as being able to publish collections online and have those available for the community members. These are all important aspects of, first of all, helping to save and spend responsibly in terms of collections care and management, because there's better informational management about them in the CMS, as well as being able to help meet stakeholder needs or expectations of being able to access collections online, being able to learn about the collections or the museum or archives, as well as just being able to enjoy some of the art, artifacts, what have you, that are available online when they can't go to the museum, or maybe those things are not available for like physical in display. So those are things that are not necessarily, again, direct revenue bringing, and yet it helps to cultivate the community, it helps to meet those stakeholder expectations and needs, and it helps for responsible management and care of items, which when responsible management is in place, then usually better money management is also there. So several indirect ways of which that particular collection work is valuable and is bringing in revenue, but in an indirect way. And when it is indirect, we need to make sure we're even better at highlighting it. And then for our last example, an educator, librarian, or archivist supporting curriculum development. So any of these types of collection workers or collection stewards the knowledge that they bring, the way that they can apply that, or to create or package collection information in a way that could be used for curriculum development in whether K through 12 schools or graduate and undergraduate work. Again, being able to meet indirectly the needs of a particular set of stakeholders, getting collections into the hands, so to speak, of these community members. These are all indirect ways, but are yet so critically important to the museum or archives meeting its mission and meeting those community needs, which indirect, again, in terms of supporting that revenue stream. So we'll talk for a minute about physical engagement and digital engagement, especially for collection stewards. For many of us, the work tends to be more in a digital realm now for digital engagement. So both are equally important for us to talk about as we think about the work that we're doing and the value that it brings. So for physical engagement, we're thinking exhibitions and displays. Those are points of engagement between the collections and our work with the audience, with the stakeholders. We're thinking of research and browsing, in this case, in person. This could be a visit to the museum, a visit to the archives, whether for specific research or just to learn more about the collection more broadly. We're thinking about classes, lectures, and special events. So whether formal classes in a classroom or perhaps a ad hoc class held at the museum, any of these are additional points of engagement. And then conversations and communing. So many people who come into a physical space, oftentimes it leads to conversations among the people they come with, conversations with the other docents or museum staff that are available in this particular case, as well as just coming to commune or otherwise have a experience with the artwork or artifacts that are on display. So all of these, whether they involve other people or not in terms of museum or archive staff, there's still about those points of engagement that we have created or have supported as collection workers. So results from that type of engagement, and I want you to, as we think about these, hold these in your mind as we start looking at the digital to see like the differences, if there are any. So results from engagement, when we're thinking of physical points of engagement, people are able to see, read, listen, and learn. So those are ways in which they're engaging. There's education and inspiration available as they're having these points of engagement. There could be respite and rejuvenation. So even if people are just coming to enjoy and like be in that communing space, and then connection. So these are the points of engagement that are happening as they're in this physical space with us, as they're in the physical space with the collections. So now shifting to digital engagement. So thinking of digital displays, which could be produced by the collections management system and or the website. We could be looking at collections online, and again, that could be facilitated by the CMS, or if you have it separate with the website delivery, either way, access to collections. It could be through various articles and blog posts, whether created by in-house in institution or adjacent related outside researcher or guest lecturer. Different lectures, webinars, tours, behind the scenes, live streams, Q&As, like any of those that could be delivered online or have been delivered online, especially as we are making our way through the early days of the pandemic and quickly trying to mobilize and bring this type of engagement in an online atmosphere. Thinking of even fun points of engagement. It doesn't have to be all like serious or purposeful. It can be games, puzzles, educational projects, and then even social media posts. So all of these are in a digital arena. They're involving either digital assets or data about our collections that are available online and providing these various points of engagement in this digital realm. So results from engagement, and as we think about results from the physical points of engagement, you'll see that these are the same, that the results are the same, whether it's physical or digital space. So people will be able to see, read, listen, and learn. People will be able to be and involved in education and experience inspiration. They will experience respite and rejuvenation if that is the purpose for engaging with the content, as well as connection. And so when we were looking at the physical, those things may have seemed more obvious. We're more used to thinking of our work in a physical way, at least until very recently. And now, of course, many museums have had collections online, and as tools and technology become cheaper and easier and more ubiquitous, our work as collection stewards will continue to build in that arena. So achieving the same points of engagement, though, which are important for us to keep in mind as collection stewards when we're then trying to capture and communicate value. So just to reiterate here, you'll notice that the value in terms of what the stakeholders get are both in both arenas for the physical and digital engagement. All right, quantify value. So how can we find evidence of value, especially when we're thinking about our work that tends to be more indirect versus direct, where it's like, here's the activity and then here's this exchange of money. That's pretty rare for most of us in our day-to-day jobs. So for our action here, we need to somehow capture quantitative, which is something measured in numbers, and qualitative, which is something that can't be measured in numbers but can be described in a narrative format. We need to capture quantitative and qualitative information from our engagement activities and then analyze that to extract the value delivered. And we'll get into some examples, don't worry. So in terms of quantifiables, and again, this is something where a number can be measured, assigned, derived from it. Some of those examples could be visitor numbers, repeated and unique. So again, whether it's that physical or digital, you're still going to have visitor numbers. And with the digital, you have the ability to more finely track who is a repeat visitor to the collection or digital exhibit online, and who may be a unique visitor there for the first time. Both numbers can be very interesting to track and very informative. Another thing that can be quantified is duration. How long are people spending either physically in the space with collections versus how many people are watching a lecture online or browsing through the digital gallery? Durations for those different aspects can additionally be informative. We can also measure an increase in visitors, viewing, or duration. So again, thinking physical space or digital space, we can quantify number of visitors. We can quantify what they're looking at, especially if we're focused on the digital collections. There can be some very specific, this item was viewed 164 times this week kind of stats. In addition to duration, there can be tracking of visitors. How long do they stay within a particular physical gallery space or digital gallery space, and those types of visit numbers. There can be a number of comments, number of discussions, questions, insights. So this is number of, not the nature or the narrative of those actual items. Those individually would be qualitative, which we'll cover in a moment. Any sort of attention from outside audiences, so that can be somewhat quantifiable in terms of how many times was the new museum exhibit picked up by local and national newspapers, how many times was something shared, which gets us into our next point in terms of any sort of social media. Typically involves membership and subscriptions, also followers, likes, and shares, or whatever they're called in a particular moment in time on the platform. But any of those can be quantified in terms of number of people, duration of time. Any of those can assign a number to it kind of activities. And the qualitative. So again, qualitative is things that can't be counted and is focused much more on the narrative of what is being described. So any sort of stories and anecdotes is like one of the first easy and obvious ones to think about. Stories from people who have visited, maybe thinking of their first time visiting, anecdotes shared by researchers who had been browsing the collections and using collections online leading up to their research appointment, things like that. Any sort of notes of gratitude or reviews, so things that were either shared directly with you, thank you emails or thank you notes, reviews of the particular museum or exhibit that was up at that time, those could all be helpful and demonstrative in a qualitative sense. Any sort of insights from experience, so perhaps something that wasn't directly shared with yourself or your peers, but something that you've been able to observe of the community and how they're navigating those points of engagement, what's working, what's not working. And then any other sort of attention grabbing information. So while it may seem for some brains where like, oh, this one comment or review or note of gratitude, it doesn't seem like it is equal to somebody viewing this item the 864 times. And they're not the same in terms of like, they just literally are not the same. However, when we are trying to communicate value, while numbers can be impressive and can help inform us if things are going well or if things need to be tweaked or things like that, often the qualitative, the narrative of it can help for many brains, if not the majority of brains, sort of solidify the concept that they are being informed by with the numbers. So they could have like, okay, we know this item is very popular. It was viewed almost 1,000 times just this week alone. However, the note from a student who used that item for their research project, while it's just one note, one student, one point of engagement, it is quite evocative and helpful for us to solidify, yes, this object is important, it's been viewed this many times, but we're also now understanding the impact in a more nuanced and more complex, in a rich way, of its impact on our community. So having both, while not necessarily equal, is not a bad thing. And to use both quantitative and qualitative can be quite powerful when we are trying to communicate the value of our work, especially to different types of people and different brains involved in terms of trying to interpret and understand that data. All right, so we need to learn how to translate engagement into value statements. For me, it's helpful to think about putting that package together like an equation, but not an intimidating equation. So we did X action, and it provided Y value that Z numbers of our community to insert the verb. So to actually use a more realistic example, we launched a VR exhibition experience, so that's our X value, for our permanent collection, and it provided a learning and enjoyment opportunity, so that Y value, that 25,000 Z value of our digital visitors have viewed and enjoyed, verb. So putting together, what was it that we did? What did it result in? What was the value? If there were numbers, what was the number? And then what did that lead our community to? So whether that was enjoyment, learning, building relationships, it really could be anything. But really demonstrating some of the quantitative and qualitative, the power of that piece, as well as like, here's the direct correlation of we did this action that led to this, which can be incredibly helpful when your work is a bit more indirect. All right, packaging options. So what we mean by this is how can we take that information, how can we take those points of engagement and quantifying the value of our work essentially into the different sort of communication packages that exist within our day-to-day sort of work structure. So for most of us, regardless, museum, archives, what have you, there's always different reports, whether it's annual department report, weekly collections report, what have you, really could be any sort of report on the work that's being done and how it's going. Emails even could be an excellent opportunity, whether informal or formal, in giving like some exciting updates or sharing a point of engagement with like a qualitative note that you received. Those can be excellent delivery mechanisms. Infographics, these are particularly helpful when you're trying to convey information for people who don't necessarily have time or bandwidth to read like the department report. In fact, for much of the projects that we do now, there's like the report, which can be lots and lots of pages, but then we'll create some sort of infographics for more actionable areas, or like here's the top 10 takeaways kind of things. So developing the infographics to impart like here's some of the most important or compelling information that could be paired with perhaps the more in-depth information. Presentations, so internal, external, doesn't matter. Presentations are a great opportunity to sprinkle in and talk about the direct or indirect values that you are bringing, points of engagement that you're supporting, and ultimately the revenue streams you're supporting with your work. Blog post, articles, press releases, these are all great opportunities to highlight the work being done, the collection's work, to highlight areas of the collection, and to help broadcast some of that either opportunities for engagement or having, for example, blog posts be that point of engagement for you. So all of these can be great ways in terms of like packaging up that value information and communicating it out, whether internally or externally. One thing to think about as you're packaging the particular information that you're wishing to share, knowing who your audience is, who you're communicating to or with, can be very informative and is something important to consider as you're writing things out, if it's a written form or as you're speaking. To what extent do you perhaps need to generalize your language or explain more technical terms? So things to think about for us as collection stewards, we typically chat, of course, with our boss. And it's important, especially if your boss is not someone familiar with collections work quite as much. Sometimes some gentle education or orientation could be very helpful. And similarly with your boss's boss or the board, as and when you ever maybe in front of them in formal or informal sense, you could even just be in like an elevator with a board member, but always take that opportunity, whether formal or informal, to help package and present some sort of highlight or some sort of recent win, something that helps to underscore the direct or indirect, but the value that you are bringing in a very real and consistent way. Another audiences to consider are our peers. And for us, that can be peers like fellow registrars, fellow archivists, depending on how large your organization is, or perhaps sometimes you're like solo person in the collections department, and your peers may be curator or professor or head librarian. So depending on who those are, they may also be subject matter experts, but in an entirely different subject. And so while they may get the collections piece of it, they may not understand or get your role as a collection steward with that collection or with the value of sharing and helping to manage and care for that collection. So sometimes peers can be the hardest just because we tend to assume too much, they understand too much, and in reality we need to provide more explanation or more education around it usually. Of course, community is a whole different beast. First of all, it's external, and then second of all, it could be an audience of any age, of any socioeconomic background. So thinking of ways to engage with and talk about our work, talk about the collections that is accessible to all of those different types of people and backgrounds. And then we've got granting agencies and donors. So these are people who are directly contributing to the museum, the collections care, the archives, what have you. and needing to be kept informed, especially if it was a specific grant that you need to report on, or if it's, Donor Appreciation Day, and so donors are coming through for a tour maybe, and being able to speak sort of one-on-one or in smaller groups about the work that you're doing and how they, as donors, have perhaps helped support that work or how they could be more involved, that kind of thing. And then a government. So whether that's city, state, or federal government, regardless of whether you're a municipal organization or not, having a level of awareness within that particular government setting can be incredibly helpful for future advocacy needs, as well as when there is funding available, making sure that you are thought of first, or at least included in those types of opportunities. All right, and the important part. All of it has been important, but this is perhaps like must get this last piece in order for all of it to come together. So communicating value. First of all, that internal piece. So thinking about our boss's boss, sometimes both, thinking about the different ways in which we could inform them and do that communication internally. So for our boss, weekly email update, it could have like a quick value anecdote, maybe like a snippet of a thank you email you may have gotten recently, perhaps a story of like a patron served, an item found, whether silly or extremely important. Usually both are very enjoyable. If you've hit a project milestone or like any lessons learned, like all of those are incredibly interesting and can be sort of sprinkled in a very informal way, but in a way that, if done with consistency, can really make a big impact for how people view and understand and value your work as a collections worker. For your boss's boss or board, sending them email to let them know about a big win, a grant won, or a project completed. So communication is usually less frequent, but there can be exceptions made, especially if it's good news. Like if it is a very quick, short email about like a really awesome, like happy note kind of thing, like nobody's mad about a happy email, as long as it's not done too frequently. So those can be great opportunities, maybe once a quarter, to sort of like send their way, just to sort of stay in their minds, especially if they're ones who are part of or involved in any sort of operations decisions, funding decisions, that kind of thing. And then if we're thinking about both, usually the annual report or department report, taking that opportunity in a formal report structure to make those clear ties of how your work supports the different income streams coming into your organization, how it supports the organization's mission. And this is where, with that report, having visuals like an infographic can be really helpful, the combination of. So again, thinking of like, here's your report, it's got everything you need spelled out. Here's the one-page infographic that's got like the top 5 things that the board needs to take away from the report. So while it is like a little bit more extra work, it can be so helpful in terms of helping that board member interpret and be excited to read more about in that department report. So that's really what the infographic is doing. It's advertising what is in the report in a more visually enticing and a little bit easier to sort of consume and understand way. All right, thinking about internal communication continued. Our peers, so email, of course, or Slack now, or what have you, with your peers, and thinking weekly or bi-weekly or monthly, depending on your organization's culture, of updates. And this could be like fun item of the week finds, behind the scenes, any sort of like aha moments, cool stats. Like this could really be like any sort of like little anecdote from the day or week or month that internal people, your peers at the organization would find cool, would at least find amusing, and again, help broadly and over time with that education and outreach piece of the you as collection steward with the rest of your peers. And then always have a collection story or something that highlights the value of your work in your back pocket so that as you run into people, as you have those elevator moments or like a few minutes before a meeting starts, any of those situations where you can like communicate just like a quick little value note about your work can be, especially over time, very effective. It also, well, for better or worse, develop a reputation for you always having cool stories, and people will start asking you about what's the latest cool find in the archives, or you mentioned the project last month about digitizing this thing, like how is that going? So it can help attune people to realizing you and your role as having interesting and valuable things to share about the collection and about your work. And then the external piece. So, community, obviously, our first external party that we're thinking about, depending on our relationship and the ways that the organization communicates with them. That could be newsletter, blog posts, social media, but using that to be transparent, to share victories or recent wins, especially if it was like a recent grant, and then perhaps even acknowledge challenges such as like conservation issues. So being with your community in an authentic and genuine way, sharing both challenges as well as amazing things that are happening within your space. And then with the granting agencies and donors and or government, whether it's in a funding role or as a governing body, there could be annual reports, there could be emails, press releases that are sent or include them. And then just sharing stats and anecdotes. For example, if you are working on a particular grant for a year and you're sending them like the requisite like halfway point report in the email, including just like a quick, fun little anecdote that will help get them excited to read the report and be very engaged with the work that you're doing. So, really thinking about externally, thinking about our community and how we are serving them. All right. And then as you orient yourself to that communication piece, especially for those of us who communication may not be our strong suit or something that we are naturally inclined to, some things to ask ourselves is first of all, what is their motivation, the person we plan to communicate with, and what are they basing their decision on? So whether it is informal or formal, whether there's that immediate decision to make on a budget or that sort of like the future decision, thinking about what it is that we need to communicate based on that. So, based on that, and then package accordingly. So, what is their motivation? What do they need to know? What decisions are coming up that may impact me that we need to communicate information on? So packaging accordingly with the focus on, of course, money, because again, capitalism, even if we're in a nonprofit situation, money is such a critical and finite resource for us that it is usually always top of mind for the majority of our stakeholders. Thinking about mission, especially if we are communicating with our board, our boss, or even granting agencies, the tie to what we're doing to mission is such a like foundational requirement to base all of our other communication on. Then thinking about strategy, like is there a strategic plan in place? Has there been a strategy, perhaps more informal in terms of trying to develop a particular community partnership? Thinking about what the organization is trying to do, what its goals are, and how your work aligns or supports those things specifically. Sometimes it's ego that is part of the motivation, which is a natural human part to some extent. And so, how does our work help support their ego? For example, if we're talking to our boss, if we're doing well, then it sort of inherently means that they're doing well. And so, for them, for their ego, packaging in a way where it's like, look, you gave us the agency to go off and explore this, and it's yielded these great results. Or, we agreed and you've supported prioritizing this type of work, and look at what we've accomplished. So, sort of tying your success as our success in a more broader way that will help that person feel like they are tied to the work that you're doing, which is ultimately helpful for you. And then because it's the right thing to do. So, motivation in terms of who you're speaking with, for most of us, and for the most part, we all like to operate and think that we are doing the right things for the right reasons. And so, being able to tie our work to because it's the right thing to do, it can be very motivational as well. So, continuing down that line of thought, as we thought about motivation for the person and any sort of decisions they may need to make based on our type of work or that could impact our work, next thinking about like what is the need to know. So as we're packaging what we're trying to convey, you will only have a finite amount of time or words to be effective, and sometimes those quantity of time or words is not always known. But we want to make sure that we're clear and concise. So, really narrowing down what's the need to know for this particular message, for this particular person, what's like the bottom line, or what's your ask. So, while you're sharing the need to know, like, what are you asking from that person? Are you asking just for support? Are you asking for their advice? Are you asking them to help you advocate for additional funding? So being very clear in like why you are sharing this information and why you are sharing it with them and what it is that you are asking them to help do. And take purposeful pauses and get comfortable in the discomfort. And this is the hardest thing to learn, at least for me. It takes practice, because because quiet spaces can sometimes feel like forever in anxiety time. However, pausing, and especially pausing long enough to allow the other person to engage and contribute, or perhaps offer back what it is that they can help with, or how they think they can help, the kind of thing. We have to allow that opportunity to exist. And sometimes when we're trying to share this news, and especially if it has an ask, it can feel very intimidating. And so we try and rush through it, and don't give that person the opportunity to contribute something or to offer something. So it's very important to think about that, especially if there is some sort of ask that you are making of that person, and giving them a moment to process that information, to think about some possible solutions or ways they can help, and engaging with you in that. So allowing that opportunity unfortunately requires that there's some pause and quiet time that happens as you wait for that other person's brain to engage. As we communicate, these of course are all like, we know these, but it's good to have these sort of front of mind, especially like as we're writing that email, or as we're writing that report, or as we're practicing our elevator pitch. So be clear, be concise, be consistent, and be on mission. So making sure that everything makes sense, that you're not offering too many examples or too many different scenarios, can all help lead to a more successful outcome in terms of like successful communication, as well as successful understanding on the other party's part, and successful engagement. And as you go through this, some things to remember. So being humble or reserved, unfortunately, in our capitalist society, is more of a liability. We need to make sure that we are capturing our successes and our triumphs, and that we're communicating those. You can still do so in a gracious and like non-egotistical way, but you do still need to communicate it. So perhaps exploring and experimenting in that space is something that you can start trying. Also, no one is going to do it for you. Uh, when I was younger in my career, this was something that for some reason in my head I just expected, like, oh, if someone sees you doing a good job, they'll say something, they'll observe it, they'll remark on it, or what have you. And it doesn't happen, or at least incredibly rarely, which means like it's on you. Like it's up to you to broadcast the success of yourself or your team across to both the internal and external stakeholders. Also, people who don't know how to do your job won't understand its value. And for many of us as collection workers, like challenge number one is often people don't know what it is that we do, or only see or understand like 10% of what it is that we do. And if they don't see that full picture, if they don't quite understand all the aspects of collection stewardship, then it's really hard to then understand a value. Like if you don't know what the work is, then it's impossible to put a value on it. So, need to understand first of all what it is that we do, and then the value. And then, of course, sometimes telling isn't enough. So, us writing emails, us sharing in staff meetings or presentations, like the telling isn't enough. Sometimes it has to be showing. So, showing the anecdote, showing, curriculum at work, showing the different types of like success you've achieved or work that you're doing can be so much more valuable than 1,000 word essay. So telling is good, but showing is often more impactful, and you'll end up needing both. Also, there's a competition for resources. Unfortunately, we, as at nonprofits, even at government agencies, like there's usually never enough financial resources for all the things that could or should be done. And so knowing that there's that competition is important to keep in mind as we're communicating needs. If you don't ask, you don't get. This is another one where, like, early career, naive Rachel thought, oh, okay, clearly the museum knows like what sort of needs there are and will provide for them. No, um, just as they may not understand exactly what it is that you do, they will not understand exactly what it is that you need in terms of any sort of tools, equipment, supplies, things like that. So if you need it, you need to ask for it. And if you're not top of mind now, you will not be top of mind when the financial decisions are made. So really making sure that you are consistent throughout the year and leading up to whenever budgets are reviewed and approved. All of that is incredibly important for as people enter whatever room it is that the financial decisions are made, that there's at least a few people in that room that understand what it is that you do, that understands the value that you are bringing, even in that indirect way, and how it ties to the mission, how it ties and supports different revenue streams, and even some different like anecdotes or examples you've shared that they can share within that room to help advocate on your or your department's behalf. So this is one of those areas that demonstrates like communicating value consistently and throughout the year can be quite critical to your future success and employment. All right, resources. So there's some great advocacy resources both for museums and archives. And so this particular slide is for museum professionals in terms of how to identify and articulate value. Several of which from the American Alliance of Museums. I believe all of these links are freely available and not behind their paywall. Also, I have a Lucidia Think Clearly blog post on resources for museums. And I do want to highlight there's a regional example from the Oregon Heritage Commission that put out a great toolkit for identifying and communicating value. So even if you're not in Oregon, I recommend you go check out that toolkit. Resources for archivists. So a couple different Society of American Archivists posts. Second bullet point is a Mad Libs elevator pitch. So it's like a 1.5 page Mad Lib style in terms of like what are the things that we're trying to capture and why are we trying to communicate it. So if your brain likes those, that might be helpful. And then the Academy of Certified Archivists talks about the archival profession specifically and meeting the critical institutional and social needs. So definitely a quick and must read. a couple webinars. We've done past iterations of this webinar, so some of it will be similar. If you really like webinars, you can check it out. And then deriving value from collections in the time of Corona. This came out like month 2 of COVID, back when we were still using the word Corona, but does help. I'm joined by Margot Note and Chris Cummings in terms of how to talk about value, find value in collections work. So we'll go through questions now. I think we have a few more minutes together. We did get a question submitted ahead of time, so I'll jump into that one, but please feel free to put your questions in the chat. So question, what value do professional archivists with an MLIS training bring to the management of collections? There seems to be a troubling trend of non-graduate hiring for archival positions across industries, and I think it's more important than ever for archivists to understand how to demonstrate the value of their training and perspective. So yes, several good things in here. So first up, you're absolutely right in terms of, especially the last 10 years, seeing an increasing trend in all sort of entry level positions, especially in the archives field, requiring usually most typically a master's in library and information science, though sometimes they also accept masters in history, masters in public history, things like that. Part of it is, I think, it is not balanced, but I think there's an attempt to balance education and experience. Certainly when I went off to get my graduate degree, which again, as you know, was about 20 years ago, at that point, people in the field were advising like, yeah, you could go get a master's, but it's kind of optional, was the vibe. And for me, I ended up deciding to get the master's because I was still fairly young, had just come out of undergrad, and so didn't have tons of experience. Whereas the balance on that other side is there are people who, through various pathways, made it into archives or museum registrar positions and have years of experience and have learned over that time probably a good chunk of what we learned in grad school. So both are important, I think, and both have value. Now, there has also in recent years been an adjustment of trying to give equitable access to these job opportunities. So understanding that people may not be coming through a formal education pathway, understanding that these people may be doing more experience type, years of experience versus degree. And because both are valuable and because both are valid pathways, trying to make sure that there's that equitable access depending on that pathway, which helps to increase or support diversity and inclusion. Another thing that we're seeing, which is sort of the opposite problem that you had stated, but we'll get to that in a second, is the over requirement of degrees. And a term that I learned recently, earlier this year, was the paper ceiling. And there's a link on this slide and we'll share it in the chat, but I've learned about this term from the 2024 Trends Watch report from the American Alliance of Museums. And for that particular one, it was discussing the over requirement of degrees or seeing position descriptions where experience could substitute or be sort of equal footing with a degree. We're now seeing like degree required no matter what and sort of that discount of experience. So it's an inequitable approach to this type of position classification. It serves to eliminate a good chunk of people who would otherwise be eligible to do that job because of the experiences that they have had versus education combination, I guess. So something to keep in mind as we're seeing some of that happening and how that is serving as a barrier to people entering the field with requiring that formal education and not considering experience. And then to your point, seeing the under requirement of degrees for positions that would require a degree and or a significant amount of experience. So for example, I've seen several this year where it's been like a head of archives position where you would typically expect a degree and 5+ years experience, or maybe no grad degree, but 10+ years experience, or what have you. But we're seeing a lowering of those requirements. So like maybe not even a degree and maybe only 2 years of experience. And both of those under requirements for a position that should have higher requirements is is unethical, because it's essentially the organization participating in wage dodging. So there's a position that should command a certain amount of education and experience and therefore command a certain salary level. But because they've not required those for the position, they are somehow justifying paying that person a lower wage. Even if the person they end up hiring does have that higher degree or does have that extensive experience, they will still justify the lower wage because they didn't technically require those things on paper. So both of these, both over requirement and under requirement, are have bad effects in both regards and definitely need to be explored more thoroughly, looked at with a more critical lens and more transparently. And this is perhaps an area where our professional organizations could take some leadership. But either way, it's something to be aware of. To get to your main question, though, now that we've sort of set that context of these things existing, is the value of archivists, and speaking to the value of archivists specifically with that degree. So when speaking about value of having a professional, I think perhaps reframing with the value of a professional, and yes, that comes with a degree, but also acknowledging, yes, that also comes with professional experience, and that there's no one right way to get there. Um, yeah, there's no one right way to get there. So knowing that you have a degree, there's that foundational knowledge for care and management. That's something you learn during your time in school. You also are very knowledgeable and aware of and have access to the applicable best practices. You have the technical and applied training through your education, and sometimes with required internships for that degree to get that level of training and be able to implement it in a real setting. And then, of course, with being an archivist, and this is something through education and experiences, needing the ability to adapt to any collection, because as we go through school, we have no idea which organizations and which types of collections we may end up working in. And so learning and honing that ability to adapt to any collection is incredibly important. Now, as I mentioned when I started out with these bullet points, is like these are not exclusive to you getting that degree. These can also be gained through like professional experience, whether that is internships or past experience as someone has worked their way a different pathway to the archives or museum in that case. So while we're talking about the value that a degree can bring, I think perhaps also reframing it to be more inclusive and more accurate to talk about the value that professional archivists bring, and that there is a difference between professional archivists that are credentialed, whether through education and or experience, and volunteer activities where volunteers may definitely be knowledgeable and may definitely have experience, but that experience and knowledge is usually much different and in much shorter quantity to a professional archivist. So just some reframing there. Having the degree is certainly like the official, yes, you've learned all the things officially. Whereas if you go the experience only route, there's not necessarily like a certificate or like a you've made it at the end. So certainly you can use that as an advocacy tool. But just knowing that when you're talking about all the things that you gain from a degree, these can also be gained through or further enhanced by the experience. All right. Well, I know we're probably past our time a couple minutes with so much good stuff and great question. Please feel free to keep in touch or follow up if you have any additional questions. And then, of course, we will send out an email tomorrow with a link to the recording and any of the links that we shared today. And thank you so much for joining us. We will see you next month.